be talking about graph matching. So let me just start with a very brief introduction on what the problem is. So the idea is very simple. Let's say that you have two networks. This could be, for example, two social networks or any type of graphs. The important point here is that the graphs are supposed to be labeled, so we know for each particular vertex, we have some way of identifying the person or whatever entity that is represented there. And well, in principle, we can imagine that the two graphs are the same. So the problem is the following. First, the labels of one of the graphs are going to be removed. So we still have the same copy, but we don't know who is who. And then they are going to be permuted. And the graph matching problem basically consists in finding the correspondence between the vertices on one graph and the vertices of the other. So, well, as you can imagine, this is, in principle, computationally hard because you can start trying all the different permutations until you find the one that matches the two networks. So you're going to have n factorial different ways of permuting, let's say, this graph until the two graphs are exactly the same. But, well, there are some computational tricks that one can use, some heuristics. For example, in this particular case, you can imagine that maybe some of the vertices can be matched according to the degree. So, for example, we have a vertex with degree 1 and the degree 1 here. So basically, the only two options are this and this, let's say, and that's going to reduce the difficulty of the problem a little bit. But yeah, so well, that's the idea, like the very basic idea of this problem. So in principle, when the two graphs are the same, this is also called the graph isomorphism problem, because, well, they are going to be isomorphic. And the idea here, well, actually, this is a very popular problem in computer science. Actually, it's still not known what's the most efficient way to solve this problem. I think there are some quasi-polynomial algorithms to solve this problem, but still, the fastest way of solving the problem in the most general way will still take more than a polynomial time, but not as much as an exponential time. So that's basically the computational problem. But in this talk, I'm interested in a statistical problem here, in which the two graphs are not exactly the same. So basically, this is going to be called the inexact graph matching problem. And this is typically going to happen in real networks. So for example, we may have two observations of a different process in the network. Maybe we have two biological networks representing different individuals or different type of data. In this example here, I have the C. elegans network, which is a worm. And basically, this is the wiring of the C. elegans brain. So each of these vertices here represents a different neuron. And we have two different ways of defining the edges in the neuron. This could be, for example, based on the chemical links between two neurons. So they communicate via some chemical edges, or maybe via some electrical connections between the neurons. Right? So the two networks are going to look slightly different. Well, actually, you can see that some edges are still showing up in both networks, but in principle, they are not exactly the same. And this may happen, for example, if we have two different animals, they are not going to be exactly, they are going to have exactly the same network, but still the networks could be very similar or somewhat related. And for some practical applications, we may want to find the correspondence between one of the networks and the other, right? So this also appears in some computer science applications, for example, in image processing, video processing, or text data analysis, in which, for example, we may be interested in matching something that is happening in one image and then what's happening later. So one way of solving this problem would be by encoding the image into a graph, defining, let's say, some vertices in the image, and then defining edges based on how similar the pixels in the image are, and then trying to match, for example, an object that is moving in a video or something like that. It also appears, for example, in the anonymization in social networks. Maybe we're interested in identifying some people based on two different data sources. Maybe this could be, the simplest example could be Facebook and Twitter, but maybe other type of data sources for some particular application, or record linkage where we have two different data collected from different sources or different databases, and we are interested in matching the individuals from one data to the other, right? Yep.
For the neuroscience application, so this is a graph matching over one patient's two, like a two screen, or just a two patients screen?
Well, it could be anything. I mean, if you have the same patient, maybe the image were computed using different techniques or different data pipelines, and so you may be interested in matching the same patient with itself based on different way of processing the data, or this could be different patients or even different animals. For example, maybe we're interested in seeing the similarities between the brain of one type of animal and the other, or something like that. But, yep. Yeah, I mean, in general, the point here is that we're going to have networks that are not exactly the same, but we still expect to have some similarity between the two networks. So that's why this is called the inexact graph matching problem. Okay, so that's the idea. So then the notation that I'm going to use in this talk is the following. So I'm going to represent graphs using their adjacency matrices. For simplicity, I'm going to assume that the two graphs have exactly the same number of vertices, although in some applications this may not happen, but let's assume that both graphs have n vertices in total. And here, A and B are going to denote the adjacency matrices of each graph. So basically, if I have a graph like this, each row and column of this matrix is going to be associated to one of the vertices, and there's going to be a 1 when the two vertices are connected and 0 otherwise. And the goal, in this case, once we convert everything into matrices, is to align the rows and columns of A and B in such a way that the two graphs, we recover some sort of correspondence between the vertices of the two graphs. So that's the general problem. Okay, so generally speaking, there are two main approaches for solving this problem. On the one hand, there are some algorithmic approaches in which we can just formulate some sort of criteria or some sort of strategy to identify the correspondence between the rows and columns of one matrix to the other. So here I have, let's say, two adjacency matrices that are kind of similar, but still a little bit different. There are different optimization strategies, search strategies, some spectral methods, and so on. And a particular one is the so-called quadratic assignment problem, in which basically what we can do is take the entries of each of the matrices and then permute the rows and columns of one matrix. So P is going to be a permutation matrix, basically just by multiplying by a permutation matrix on both sides. We just simply change the rows and columns of, let's say, the second matrix here. And then this loss function is quantifying how different the two networks are. Yes?
So, I mean, the question is, so basically you know one adjacency matrix and you want to like match that another adjacency matrix to the known one, right?
Right.
That's the goal, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So let's say, well, in this case, they are matched already, but let's say we observe a permuted version of this matrix. So we want to identify P in order to align the rows and columns of this matrix to this one. Yep.
It is how the inner product is defined in the matrix space.
Oh, yeah, in the matrix space, the inner product is basically the sum of all the entries. So each entry here times each entry here. It's basically like the vector product, but
Just defined as this equation?
well, actually, no, this equation, these are equivalent formulations because
Oh,
some of
I
the
see.
terms here are going to be
Definition.
constant. Yeah, this is not the actual definition,
Uh-huh.
but basically, in this case, it's kind of obvious what we're computing because we're just taking the number of H disagreements, but typically the formulation is stated in this way. So we just want to solve this quadratic assignment problem in order to find P. But yeah.
Just a question. So when we are looking at the inexact matching of the two adjacency matrices, what are like the similarities we are trying to look at? Because I understand for the exact matching, but what's that for the inexact matching?
So for the inexact matching in this loss function, the idea is that we want to minimize the number of differences between the two matrices. So basically, let's say that P is the identity matrix, and suppose that we know that P is the correct solution. So in principle, it's expected that this P is going to minimize the number of edge disagreements between one matrix and the other. So if you choose a ground P, then you're going to increase the number of differences in the two matrices, and then this loss function is going to increase. That's why you want to minimize with respect to all the permutations. Or you can define it in this way, but I think this one is a little bit more intuitive. Okay, so that's one approach. Another approach that is also commonly used is to define some sort of random graph model that generates the two graphs according to some distribution. And the idea is that based on these random graph models, we know some sort of ground truth correspondence between the vertices of one graph and the other. And then we can just operate with this model in a way that we can recover the correspondence. I'm going to talk about some ideas on this sense later on. But a very popular model that has been developed and studied in several recent works is the correlated Erdős-Rényi graph model. So the idea is very simple. Let's say we have a Bernoulli distribution for the edges of the two networks. So each pair of vertices is going to be connected with some probability P independently of the others. But we're going to assume that the edges are correlated with some parameter rho. So in principle, if rho is equal to 0, then the two edges are independent and the two graphs may not look the same. On the other hand, if rho is equal to 1, then Aij and Bij are going to be exactly the same. So then we come back to the exact graph matching problem, and we know that the solution is, well, when the two graphs are exactly the same. And values of rho in between may generate networks that are more or less similar. But the point is that once we have this model, we know that the correct correspondence between the vertices of one graph and the other, and then we can just formulate the graph matching problem based on either the likelihood function or some sort of heuristics that can match the two networks. So that's the general idea. So in this talk, I plan to focus on, especially in the second idea. So I'm going to talk about some random graph models for the problem. And once we have the model, the simplest approach for finding the correspondence between the two networks would be to use the maximum likelihood estimation principle. Right? So we know how to measure the difference between the two networks based on the likelihood. So we can just try to maximize the likelihood in order to obtain the maximum correspondence between the two graphs. And that's going to be defined as the solution of the graph matching problem in this case. And now, well, we have some questions still. The first question is, when is the MLE going to be consistent, right? So we want the MLE to be consistent in order to make sure that the two networks are correctly matched, and under what conditions we can expect that the problem is going to be solvable or not. And on the other hand, we also have some computational aspects, because as you can imagine, solving this problem is not that easy in principle, because we're solving over the set of permutations. So it may be computationally expensive, but sometimes there are tricks that can be used to improve that. And I'm going to show you some illustrations on simulated and real networks. And I'm going to focus on two different works. One is going to be basically the problem that I just described. We have two uniparted graphs, and we want to match them. The second one is a slightly different problem. Well, I'll talk more in detail later, but essentially one of the graphs is going to be bipartite and the other one unipartite, and we still want to find the correspondence in some sense. Okay. So any questions at this point? By the way, I forgot to mention, but feel free to interrupt me at any time with any question.
What you mean is the unipartite graph is the same color?
So by unipartite, I mean that in this graph, all the vertices are of the same type. So we can have edges between any pair of vertices.
Oh.
In the bipartite, we're going to have two different classes of vertices. Okay. So then the edges only go from one class to the other. Okay, so let me start with the first part. So the model that I'm going to use here is very simple. So let's say we have a graph A, the red one here, and then we're going to form a graph B by corrupting the edges of A with some probability P. So essentially for every edge here, we're going to create a random variable, a Bernoulli random variable. With probability P, we're going to remove the edge. With probability, with probability P, we're going to change the edge. If we have an edge, we're going to remove it. If we don't have an edge, we're going to create the edge, for example, here. And with probability 1 minus P, we're going to keep the graphs the same. So in principle, if P is 0, these two graphs are going to be exactly the same. If P is 1, they are going to be the complement of the other, and values in between will generate graphs that are more or less similar. And then we're going to use a permutation queue to change the order of the vertices, and that's how we create a new graph P.
What do you mean flip edge? This is the indirect graph. So if you flip, that's the same, right?
Oh, by flipping, I mean that if we have an edge, we remove it, and if we don't have an edge, we create it. Yep. Yeah. Okay, so, well, that's a very simple model. In principle, this can be extended to allow for different probabilities for each edge. I'm not going to focus on that, but there are some extensions that we have in the paper. But yeah, so the idea is this. So once we have the model, as I mentioned at the beginning, what we're going to do in order to find the solution of the graph matching problem is to maximize the likelihood function. And then we can define the Q hat, the MLE, as the solution that matches the vertices of one graph to the other. So basically, in this case, the likelihood is very simple because it's just a Bernoulli distribution. So we just need to compute for a given permutation Q, whether the two edges in one graph and the other are the same. And P is going to be the parameter for the probabilities. So it's possible to show with a little bit of math that if you have this particular way of generating the graph, we actually recovered the original problem that I mentioned at the beginning, the quadratic assignment problem, in which basically when we try to maximize the likelihood, this is equivalent as minimizing the number of edge disagreements between one graph and the other, right? So basically here, we're finding the permutation Q. This pi n is going to denote the set of permutations of n vertices. And we're finding the permutation Q that minimizes the number of edge disagreements between A and a permuted version of B. And in principle, this is also possible. This is also true if the probabilities are not the same. If we have different, let's say, Pij for every pair of edges. So these result also holds. So we can use this loss function now in order to compute the correct solution according to the maximum likelihood estimator. Okay, so that's the first thing. Okay, so now the next question is, when is this approach going to give us the correct answer? So when is the MLE going to be correct or consistent? The idea in analyzing the consistency of the MLE is based on the fact that if A and a permuted version of A are very similar, then by corrupting the edges of A, we may remove some important information, and then we may not be able to recover the permutation again. On the other hand, if this value, A and a permuted A, is very large, even if some of the edges of A are corrupted, we may still have enough information in order to recover the correct permutation. So here I have some examples. If K is equal to 2, for example, we're going to choose two vertices, let's say these two. We flip them using some permutation. And in this case, this difference is going to create 4 edge disagreements, right? So let's say this, and these two, the new ones. So in this case, the corrupting model is going to destroy this correspondence between A and B if it's exactly permuting this, or is exactly flipping these edges, right? So in principle, we don't want this just to be flipped because otherwise we won't be able to recover the permutation. If K is equal to 3, we can also do the same. We can choose 3 vertices here, and then this is going to be the total number of edge disagreements. So in principle, we want this number to be large, so that even if some of the edges are corrupted, we are still able to recover the correct permutation. And I'm going to denote by pi nk as the set of permutations that permute exactly k vertices. Okay, so, well, in order to study the consistency, basically, we're going to analyze this quantity. And it's possible to show that the MLE is going to be consistent as long as this quantity is large enough. And large enough is going to mean that the number of edge disagreements after permuting A is larger than this quantity. So here I have a sequence of networks because I need n to grow. So the networks are going to be growing with n. And we have a sequence of probabilities. So essentially, if the probability P is very small, this is going to be very close to 1/2. So this is going to be like a constant, and that won't change too much. But basically, this tells you how much noise the model is able to handle. If P is very close to 1/2, this quantity is going to be very large. So we need a larger value on this side. We need more edge disagreements in order to distinguish one graph from a permuted version of itself. But as long as this lower bound holds for any possible value of k, we should still be fine, and we can recover the correct solution via the maximum likelihood estimation principle.
Very silly question. As I recall, the definition for MLE is the beginning norm of AN minus QP transpose.
Right.
But here is a QA Q transpose.
Right. So yeah, that's a good question. So here in this model, basically A is going to be a parameter of the model in the sense that B is generated based on A.
Oh.
So we're looking at how much noise this permitted B can handle based on A. So I mean, because A is sort of a parameter, we want an A that is very different from itself once we permute this one. Yeah, so basically that's what we have on the left-hand side, and on the right-hand side, we just have how much noise the network can handle. And we also have the converse result. If we have enough, or if the number of edge disagreements is not large enough, so if it's upper bounded by this quantity, then the MLE is going to fail. Because, well, the permutation can just, the corrupting channel can just destroy some of the important edges, and then we may not be able to recover the correct solution. Okay, so that's basically the theory. And now, how can we use this theory? Well, in principle, this works for any A as a parameter, any given network, but we can study what happens when we have some specific way of generating A. So for example, if A is an Erdős-Rengyi graph, so an Erdős-Rengyi graph is just simply a graph in which the edges are generated at random with some probability alpha. Here it's going to depend on how many edges we have, right? If alpha is very small, you can see that here permuting A with itself is not really going to create many edge disagreements. And the corrupting channel may just simply remove these edges, and then we lose all of the information. Whereas if A is large enough, we may still have some hope of recovering the edges. So based on that result, it's possible to show that if the probability for creating an edge here in the original graph is larger than this quantity, then the MLE is still going to be consistent. So again, I mean, this is just telling you how much noise the model can handle, and that depends on how large the network is. If n is larger, then we can handle more noise, and how large alpha is. We can do the same analysis for other type of models. For example, for the Newman-Watts model, this is a way of generated networks with the small world property. So the idea is that we have two parameters, D and beta. D is the size of a grid in a network. So basically, this creates a lot of triangles in the network here, depending on the value of D, right? But essentially, this is sort of emulating the idea that locally, the networks are very well connected. So, for example, if you know a person and the other person knows a person, it's very likely that the two of you are connected. Right? So locally, the networks kind of look like this. But globally, it's easy to find a way to connect from one person to another, right? So maybe, I don't know, maybe you don't know the president, but maybe one of your friends is close to another friend that knows the president, right? And actually, that's a phenomenon that is observed in real networks. So the Newman-Watts model is emulating this idea by creating random edges with some probability beta. So as beta is large enough, it's very easy to move from one place of the network to the other.
Beta is corresponding to the alpha in Arroyo streaming.
Right, exactly. Yes.
What is the D and E?
B is the number of neighbors to which each vertex is connected.
Each one has 6 neighbors.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah. So if this is larger, then it means that sort of like your local neighborhood is larger. So then you have more people that are very well connected with each other. So here we can use the same ideas to check whether this model is consistent or not. So in principle, if beta is small, like in this case, for example, it's going to be the MLE may fail because essentially we don't have enough information again to distinguish from one permutation and the other, right? But as long as beta is large enough, as long as we have random edges in this model, then we are still fine and we are able to record that permutation that matches the two graphs A and B. Yes.
Pn is the probability of turning off or on an edge.
Right.
So is it like symmetric? It's 1/2 minus Pn squared. So if it's 1 or if it's 0, it's the same thing. Is that because you're turning them on and off with the same probability? Like it seems confusing to me that if Pn is 0 and Pn is 1, the result is the same.
Yeah, actually, I think I should have mentioned this, but I'm assuming in most parts that Pn is smaller than a half.
Okay.
If Pn is larger than 1/2, then you can work with the complement of the graph.
Okay.
And the results will still hold. If Pn, basically, yeah, this is just measure how close Pn is to 1/2, because when Pn is 1/2, you are just completely destroying the network at random.
Yeah.
This means the Newman-Watts model is a special case of the Arroyo streaming.
Well, not exactly a special case, because you have this grid as the original generator of the model. Well, yeah, in some sense it's related because this is sort of like grid plus Nerdos range.
Because this one has a fixed number of neighbors, and Arroyo streaming has no this kind of restriction. Does this, from this sense, this is a special case?
Well, yeah, actually, yeah, that's true. I mean, if this is equal to 0, then this is just the Erdos range, right? Yeah, that's a good point. Okay. Well, so that's the so here are some examples with some network models. So we can analyze in simulations what happens with different network models. So for example, here I have a comparison of the Erdos range model, the Watts-Strogatz model, which is actually very similar to the Newman-Watts model, but this one is harder to analyze because more dependencies, but I mean, this still generates networks with the small world property and preferential attachment networks, which basically have the property that the rich gets richer. So if you have a lot of friends and new people that come to the network are going to become your friends, and that's going to depend on how many friends you had in the past. Right. So basically, here I'm computing the number of edge disagreements between A and itself. Like this is the quantity that is important for matching, and we can see that for different network models, essentially the Erdos range graphs are sort of like the most resistant to edge disagreements, in the sense that the quantity here in this theorem, let me go back, is going to be larger. So if you have a graph that is created totally at random, this quantity is going to be larger, so it's going to be more likely that you're resistant to noise in the model. So graph matching is going to be easier. On the other hand, if you have something like a preferential attachment graph, for this type of graphs, what usually happens is that a few vertices have a lot of connections, and there are many vertices that have very small number of connections. So in those ones, just removing a few edges may make impossible to recover the correct permutation, because essentially you don't have enough information for each vertex to be able to match correctly to the other network. Yeah, this is just to give an idea on what happens with different random graph models. Here I have another comparison between different networks. I'm going to skip this comparison for the interest of time, but basically we can use the same approach to measure how tolerant to noise different networks are. Okay, so this was the first idea of matching uniparted to uniparted networks. So before I move on to the next part, are there any questions? Yes.
So would 1/2 be approximately the maximum of these graphs here?
So 1/2 in this,
Like when 1/2 of the vertices are shuffled, that's where the probability bound is the largest.
yeah, so when 1/2 is are shuffled, yeah, in that case, basically what happens is that, let me go back here. So when P is 1/2, what happens is that these two networks are completely different, because essentially each vertex is going to be each edge is going to be randomly generated with probability 1/2. So essentially they are completely independent, and it's impossible to match them. That's why in this denominator here, essentially when P is close to 1/2, then there's not really a solution, because this is going to be unbounded. Okay. Well, so that's one particular way of matching two networks that have uniparted vertices. Okay, so for the second part, I'm just going to show you a little bit quickly how to solve this other problem. So now, instead of considering two uniparted vertices, let's suppose that one of the networks is bipartite. So here we still have, let's say, a social network, but now in the bipartite network, we may have information about how people like to go to different places, or the places that they have visited, or maybe two different types of entities. This could be some type of unit, some type of entities, and this could be something completely different. And the way these two are related. So again, and we have the same problem. We don't know the identities of the people in the second network, but we still want to find a correspondence between the two of them. So the main issue that we have here is that we don't have edges on this network between these vertices in order to get information to match the two graphs, right? In the previous case, what we were doing is sort of like finding how similar these edges were with the edges on this part, but now we don't have them anymore. However, as you may expect, there's still some shared information between one network and the other, typically. So for example, in this case, maybe the places that you visit are going to depend on the places that your friends also visit, or the information that your friends tell you about the places that they visited. Maybe they didn't like a place and then you're not going to visit that place. So having knowledge of one of the graphs is still going to inform something about the way people connect to the other set of entities. So we still have
This tripartite graph is different from the graphs with confounders.
graphs with confounders.
Like, we don't know on node, but that's both of them.
I see. Well, I guess this bipartite graph may have something like this, but yeah, I mean, I'm not completely sure. Maybe we can talk a little bit more about that at the end, but yeah, I'm not completely sure about those type of graphs. But yeah, well, the point is that we have now these two networks, right? So the idea that I'm going to use in this part of the talk is very similar. So first, we need to formulate a model that generates these two networks in such a way that we have some shared information between one network and the other. And once we have the model, everything is sort of simple for the graph matching part, because we can apply the same idea. We find the MLE of the model in order to find the correspondence between one graph and the other. And then we just need to formulate some optimization problem for the MLE. In this particular case, finding the MLE is going to be a bit harder. So we need some sort of relaxations for this problem. And I'm going to show that we can use some known problems like the graphical lasso in order to solve this problem. But yeah, so the idea is, I mean, the general approach is similar to the previous one. So how are we going to formulate the model? So let's say we have A, which is an adjacency matrix with n vertices, and B is now an incidence matrix or a data matrix. And I mean, this could be any arbitrary matrix with n rows and n columns, where m is going to denote the number of vertices on this set, or maybe this could denote different variables or any other type of information. So the idea here is that we're going to use undirected graphical models for B, conditional on A. So basically, we can enforce the local Markov property in the sense that if we know the information of this network, the dependencies on the edges here are only going to be affected by who is friend of who in the network here, right? So say, for example, this dog and the monkey are friends. So then, as long as we know the choices that the monkey makes, everything else is not going to affect the choices that the dog makes, right? So basically, that's what this is giving. If we know the neighborhood of a vertex, everything else is going to be independent of anything that is not in the neighborhood, right? So that's the way we're going to relate one network to the other. Now, to formulate the problem more precisely, we need to simplify it a little bit. So in particular, we're going to make the assumption that the second network, the bipartite one, comes from a generalized linear model distribution. So essentially, the only assumption here is that the likelihood function is going to have this form. So we can represent the likelihood with this matrix theta. And this theta is sort of related to the original network, in the sense that if two people are not connected in A, in the unipartite graph, then the entries of this matrix here are going to be 0, which is basically enforcing the local Markov property. So once we formulate the model in this way, we can still think of graph matching as matching A with theta, right? So basically, the zeros of theta correspond to the zeros of A, and we just want to find the same pattern. The issue here is that we don't know theta, because this is a parameter of the model, and we just observe B. Some sort of random variable generated from this model, but we don't observe theta. In principle, we could try to estimate theta using any graphical model approach. But as I will show you later, this will usually result in worse performance than trying to estimate everything jointly. So what we're going to do here is try to solve the problem using the MLE in the same way as before. So we try to maximize the likelihood of the second network B, which in this case only depends on the parameters P, the permutation matrix, and theta. So essentially, if I give you some way of aligning the vertices of one graph to the other, I know where the zeros of theta are going to be. So I can just enforce this restriction here. And then I just need to maximize the likelihood for the observed edges of B. Right. So yeah, so that's going to be the MLE for finding the matching between the two networks. We also have some theory which is similar to the one before, in the sense that the result still depends on how different A from a permutation of A is. But as long as this network has sufficient differences, we should still be able to recover the correct permutation consistently. And now, in the previous part of the talk, we still had this part. We measured how different A was with the permutation of itself. But in the lower bound, we had the probabilities. It's going to be harder. In this model, well, because we don't have probabilities on the edges, but what we have here is the difficulty in estimating the parameters of the graphical model here. So in particular, this difficulty depends on how many edges we have on A. If we have a denser network here, we have more parameters to estimate, and this is going to become more complicated. And it also depends on how many vertices we have on this side, or how many variables we have here. As we get more and more information, then estimating this part is going to be simpler, and then we require a lower threshold for and getting consistency in the MLE. Okay, so yeah, just quickly mention how to do this computationally. So finding the MLE is simply hard. So what we're going to do is relax the problem. First, we relax the permutations to doubly stochastic matrices. So instead of having a discrete permutation here, we're going to have a continuous space. We write the problem in a Lagrangian formulation, and then we do alternating optimization. And it turns out that solving this problem is actually not that hard, as long as we relax it, because one of the steps is going to be equivalent to the Gaussian graphical model approach with the graphical lasso. So essentially, this is the log likelihood of the data, and then some penalty here that basically penalizes with the L1 norm some of the entries of data, like in the graphical lasso. And then the other part is just using the quadratic assignment problem that I mentioned at the beginning, that can still be solved efficiently.
Please give the definition for the doubly stochastic matrix.
So a doubly stochastic matrix D is one that its rows and columns sum 0 to 1.
Oh.
So actually, the permutations are a particular case of doubly stochastic matrices because there's only a single one on each column and row. But by relaxing these two doubly stochastic matrices, this is the convex envelope of the permutations. That becomes continuous instead of discrete. Okay, so this is the computational approach to solve the problem. I have the algorithms here. I'm going to skip this part. There's another algorithm that uses the pseudo likelihood instead of the Gaussian graphical model likelihood. But the idea is very similar, so I'm going to skip this one. And I'll just show you some simulation results. So here, I'm simulating data based on a chain graph. So this is going to be A, and B is going to be generated from a Gaussian graphical model. In this case, estimating the graphical model is easy. This is a problem well studied in statistics. And I mean, there are multiple methods for doing this. And so this is not that hard because this is just a chain graph, so there are not a lot of dependencies. However, here, as you can see, estimating the graph matching solution is going to be hard because we don't have a lot of information for each edge. By just removing one of the edges, or if we estimate one of these edges incorrectly, then we're not going to be able to recover the permutation. So this is what we observe in simulations as well. The error in the vertices is large. We have almost 100% error, but the error in the edges is small because estimating the parameters of the graphical model is not that hard. On the other extreme, if we have a completely random network from the Erdos-Renyi model, as you may remember from the first part of the talk, graph matching is going to be easy because we have a lot of information on this edge, but the graphical model estimation part is hard because we have a lot of dependencies in the model. So estimating the parameters of the Gaussian graphical model is not that simple. So this is also what we observe here. We can still match the vertices correctly. The first two are the approaches that we propose based on the algorithms that I showed you. And the edges are still possible to estimate, but it gets a little bit harder. I also have an illustration here with some real data based on structural brain networks. So this is the connectivity of different vertices according to the nerve tracks that connect them anatomically. And then we also have fMRI Bolt signals. So for each vertex, we observe the level of oxygen. And this is measured with a time series. So basically, we have n time series, one per vertex. So we're going to assume that we don't know the correspondence of these two, and we're going to try to match the fMRI signals to the structural brain network. So what we observed is something very similar. As we increase the number of scans in the fMRI network, so as we increase, let's say, the time that the person is going to the scanner, and then it gets the person gets the signals to scan, then the accuracy of the matching solution is going to improve. And here I'm just showing what happens if you do A as a binary network or as a weighted network. But in both cases, we see some improvement in the error as we add more scans. So basically, this is suggesting that having longer sessions for scanning is giving more information between the structural and the functional network of the brain. And well, so basically, this was the idea on this talk. We propose some methods for integrating two data sources based on graph matching. And the main idea here is we need a statistical model for the two networks. And once we have the model, we can just simply estimate everything via. So something that I wanted to mention before I finish. So I have a current problem that I started working this summer with Xingyu Liu and Yufan Li. They are students in the 3+2 program. So, well, actually, the original problem here didn't involve graph matching at all. We were just collecting data from academic and collaboration networks. So in the academic relationship data, we basically have who's advisor of whom and a large collection of statisticians. So we have thousands of people here. And in the collaboration network, we know whose person is collaborating with whom. So maybe people collaborate because they have similar interests. Well, it could be that the way they were trained in their PhD affects the interests that they have. Right? So we were interested in understanding the association between these two networks. But the issue that we found here is that the two networks are don't have the same vertices. And it's actually not that easy to match the vertices of one network and the other, because there are multiple issues with the names. There's people that have the same name or similar names, and it's not that easy to match one network to the other, right? So the approach that I thought for solving this problem is basically, well, if we know how to do graph matching, then we can try to use graph matching, because essentially we know that people, for example, student and advisor typically publish together, and maybe the students publish with other students from the same advisor, or there's some information in common. So our goal here now is to try to use some of the ideas that I mentioned in this talk in order to find the correspondence between these two networks that I have here. This is still an open problem, so if you are interested in this problem, talk to me and we can see if we can come out with a solution. But basically, what we require here is to figure out a way to relate the two networks, maybe some sort of model that describes how the collaborations are formed based on the way people are related based on student and advisors. And then, because this network actually has a not that difficult structure, these are tree-like graphs. It may not be that hard to find some efficient way of matching this network to the other. I mean, we have a few relationships, so then running algorithms on trees could be more efficient. And then this also opens some statistical inference questions, because what if we didn't get the solutions correctly, right? So maybe by looking at the model and the results, we can figure out who are the people in this network that are not correctly matched, and we can do those manually, or maybe we can try other ways of matching those people correctly. So that's almost all. And the final thing is an advertisement. So next semester, I'm going to be teaching a special topics class on networks. So this is going to be a 3 credit course, and I will discuss different topics on network analysis. Maybe some of you already took the class last semester, the Frontiers class, but that was only 1 credit. So, I mean, well, if you want to take it again, that's right. But if you're interested in network data analysis, you can consider taking this course next semester. And yeah, that's all. So thank you. And let me know if you have any questions.
Question. And the neuroscience data, your imaging data is spatial temporal data. So in each time point, you run your algorithm, right, to compare the random graph. Each time point, you run again.
I see. Yeah, I think I didn't explain this very carefully. But so here, what I'm considering is that the different locations are going to be the vertices in common between the two networks, but each time point is going to be a different vertex in the bipartite network. So basically, instead of looking at this network here as binary, let's say this graph, we can define that this is going to be a different time point, and this is going to be the blood oxygenation level at each time point. So this is just going to be a matrix rather than being a binary network or something.
This means that your algorithm import is a full spatial temporal data instead of like a new data and each time point come in, you import again. Is it recursively or just a whole set?
It takes the whole set of time points. And actually, this method doesn't really consider the time component. You can permute the time and it will give you the same results. This is something that maybe can be studied more carefully.
Oh, I see.
But yeah, I mean, yeah. Yes.
So in order to get consistency results, you sort of have not just a local connectivity, but some sense of asymptotic global connectivity as well. So like as network grows, each vertex need to actually have more edges, some sense, right? In order to get consistency. When applying it to networks where there's really not that type of property, because like as you know, in the brain, as the number of samples of neurons grows, that doesn't necessarily mean that you are observing further connections, because neurons are going to be connected to each other instead of like global. I guess, are you getting around consistency results there by just relying on timestamps?
Right. Yeah. You're right. Actually, here the theory for this part relies on how many vertices we have on the second network. So as you have more vertices, so for example, in the brain network, as you have more timestamps, M is going to increase, so then you get a lower threshold for consistency. Or in a social network, maybe if you collect more information about places that people like to visit, then you are going to have more information for the graphical model. So yeah, I mean, essentially it relies, well, we have N and M, but here N actually hurts the performance because we have more parameters to estimate, but M gives you more samples.
You can find an MLE, but because the space of permutation is not smooth, how do you characterize like close permutations?
Yeah, actually, that's a good point. So, I mean, for the theory, we're assuming that we can compute the MLE, but in practice, that's not true. Computing the MLE is actually NP hard. So we're just relaxing the space of permutations to doubly stochastic matrices. So, yeah, I mean,
then let's to like the closest permutation.
Yep, yeah, right. So once you estimate some doubly stochastic matrix D, there are some methods that can project back to the permutation, to the closest permutation.
So when you like characterize, I guess the closest doubly stochastic matrix are like nearby doubly stochastic matrices, also like their projections onto permutation matrices. Are those also like close estimates in some sense, or do you have guarantees about like with the MLE, the Hessian can help describe sort of confidence regions, right? Do you have a sense of confidence regions even in smooth space?
Yeah, well, the answer is no. We don't have any guarantees for this relaxation. So yeah, I mean, the hope is that they are close, but yeah, I think getting theory for this is harder, but yeah, this could be an interesting problem as well.